Interviews and insights with the biggest names in Canadian baseball. This is the CBN Podcast.
Welcome everyone to a special episode of the Canadian Baseball Network podcast. Today we will be discussing a pretty hot topic in Toronto. It's the Blue Jays 2022-2023 offseason. A lot of moves, Jackson.
You know, it was an interesting offseason based on a lot of sort of fan favorites leaving, a different direction for sure, but a clear message, I think, sent from the front office. And I think this is a deeper, better ball club, frankly, heading into 2023.
Yeah, and I think we're obviously going to dive into all of that, but let's just kind of go back to when the season ended, obviously in heartbreaking fashion. A Castillo gem and a blown lead, and that was the end of 6 months of pretty exciting baseball.
You're right. It was just very abrupt. I think that's a good word for it, and disappointing. This is a team that was hosting the wild card. 92 wins in the AL East is never easy, and a team that has, obviously, some people categorize that loss in the wild card series as a mischance for this core, right? Vladdy and Bo still pretty cheap, right? Teoscar was still around and still under control. Springer still young-ish on that contract, albeit with the injuries, etc. Manoah still cheap and controllable. It just felt like the core of this team was very much primed to go on a run, and it would have been good timing for that. But sports and baseball do not care about your individual timing, and that became very apparent. Seattle outplayed them. Seattle was a really good team, as we'll get to. I think some of the themes that emerged this offseason came directly from that series.
Yeah, and it's funny now thinking back. I did a piece for the Canadian Baseball Network before the season started. 3 reasons why the Jays would win the AL East and 3 reasons why they wouldn't. And one of the themes of why they would be, kind of getting over that heartbreak of the last day of the season in 2021. Now we're sitting here over a year later, and it's now talking about the heartbreak of that wild card series loss. And I think that narrative kind of goes away now because it's kind of put up or shut up for the Jays as they've shown with these moves. And, the fan base is getting antsy to see some successful and a long, deep playoff run.
Yeah, and so you take a look at some of the needs that the Jays had entering this offseason. As you said, sort of back-to-back disappointing ends to seasons, right? Obviously, the big one for the last couple of years has been balancing the lineup a little bit, right? Trying to get some more quality left-handed hitting. The Jays for the last 2 years had been predominantly right-handed. Their best hitters were right-handed. And that's not necessarily a bad thing on the surface, but I think what it did was just make the Jays a little predictable when it came to their at-bats. Righties, right-handed starting pitchers were easily able to work through the lineup because they could target the same locations in the zone time and time again against right-handed hitters. There wasn't a lot of shift in the strategy needed, right? Especially the middle of their lineup last year. You've got guys like Chapman who are really 3 true outcome players, right? A walk, a strikeout, or a home run. Teoscar would get his base hits, but he was largely the same thing. And so you sort of had this lineup that just didn't feel nimble enough to go on a deep run. It felt like if they ran into a really good pitcher, i.e. Luis Castillo, or a really good bullpen like Seattle had, that they would have issues. And while they were able to generate offense in the second game, we know that how that one ended. But it wasn't just the wildcard series. It was really throughout the season, Matt. It felt like in many cases, this lineup was just inconsistent. They never really got going all at once. And I think part of that was because of Vladimir Guerrero Jr. did not have the same year as he did in 2021. Bo Bichette struggled at times as well. There were injuries, right? Springer was injured throughout the year. Jansen was injured throughout the year and could never really get going.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with most of that. I think, over a course of 162 games, not having that kind of diversity in the lineup as far as right, left, can be, it feels like you're rolling the same lineup out there every night. And depending on the pitcher you're facing, that can be, provide serious issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so then to add on to that, of course, you had sort of questionable outfield defense at times. It felt like, Springer is still a very good center fielder, but inching closer to the average than the above average.
I think the thing with Springer too is that's kind of as they say, the straw that stirs the drink. Mm-hmm. And when you take a guy like that out of the lineup consistently, for long stretches, fans may not realize how important that is to have that guy in the lineup. And you see it when he plays. I mean, you saw it when Houston when he played. Mm-hmm. He was the he kickstarted that lineup there. He kickstarts this one. So it's very important for him to be in the lineup.
And he's such a unique leadoff hitter, right? A guy who has obviously the pedigree and the World Series MVP and all that, but the power coming in the leadoff spot, which isn't always the case. Now, I think the game is moving closer to a guy who can hit for power and putting one of your best hitters in leadoff spot as opposed to just someone who's fast and gets on base. But you're totally right. And I think that was clearly a directive for the Jays this offseason was how are we going to make it so that George Springer, one of the most important players in this lineup still, despite his age, is healthy and can play more than what he's played the last 2 years. And hopefully you can get, 140 games out of him and a ton of innings out of him now in right field based on the additions.
Well, and that's the thing. I think taking him out of center and kind of taking that defensive pressure off of him, he's more than capable of still playing it, I believe. But taking that defensive kind of him having to be the guy out there patrolling center and taking control. And now it's Kevin Kiermaier who they acquired this offseason. I think that's going to be big and getting him off his feet. There's some flexibility around the designated hitter position and just giving him, days off. That's just part of it as you get older as a player. People say playing on the turf doesn't help, but it's a long season. A few days off here and there, isn't gonna make or break the team.
And since we're talking about the outfield, we'll get to the rotation and we'll get to the bullpen in a second, but let's talk about that first big move that the Jays made this offseason. We're not going to talk about every single move they've made, designated for assignments and things like that. We're not going to go through that. The big stuff that happened, sort of the big transformative moves. And the first one was, Teoscar Hernandez got traded to the Seattle Mariners for Eric Swanson and left-handed pitcher Adam Macko, who is currently the 8th-ranked Toronto prospect via MLB.com. So Teoscar, a guy who represented so much about the greatness of this Jays team, the big smile, but also a big bat in the middle of the lineup, a guy who had kind of made his name here sort of as an unheralded acquisition way back, and a guy who the two knocks on him were didn't play great defense and struck out way too much, way too susceptible to the slider. And he really made adjustments, I'd say, in both areas. He improved defensively, although he's certainly not Kevin Kiermaier or anything like that out there. But he represented a lot of good about this Jays rebuild. And he was a surprise. Everyone knew about the blue chip prospects, Vladdy and Bo coming up, right? But Teoscar was a guy who was already a little bit established in the majors and really just found his role here. And I think that fans were really upset when he got moved because, let's be honest, like he was a huge part of this team. He was one of the most productive hitters in all of baseball here for the last few years. And a lot of people said, okay, well, so you traded this fan favorite great hitter for a bullpen arm and a pitching prospect?
Yeah, it's what when I first saw this deal, my initial reaction was what is going on here? Obviously, I'd love to see Adam Macko come back home to Canada, but I think I started thinking about it, and there's so many moving parts. Teoscar last year of his contract, going to hit free agency. Is he one of those core guys that you're going to shell out money to when you have Bo and Vladdy to pay? Probably not. They needed to upgrade the bullpen. Everyone knows that they were the bullpen was kind of the punching bag of this team for the last couple has been for the last couple of years.
Yeah.
And you get a guy like Swanson, sub-2 ERA, 70 strikouts, and I believe 53 in a third innings. That was another big complaint, that not enough strikeouts out of the bullpen. Yeah. And you hear, this drives me nuts, is you'll hear, oh, well, that was a fluke season. Or that might be a fluke. As someone that's played the game, anyone that's watched the game, played the game, understands the game, you don't have a fluke season in Major League Baseball. You don't get through 50-something appearances and post those kinds of numbers as a fluke. Will he repeat that? Probably not, to be honest with you, but he's still going to be a valuable piece of the bullpen. And then Macko, a very highly rated prospect. I did a lot of reading up on him, and a lot of people feel very highly of him. And I think something that people aren't considering is that's the exact kind of arm that someone wants at the deadline. A rebuilding team at the deadline looking to, for whether it's a rental or a bigger name player, guys like Adam Macko are the types that are, going to get that. Or you keep him and see what he develops into. I think that was a sneaky acquisition there to get him in that deal. And obviously being Canadian, I'm all for it.
And it sounded like, regarding Macko, that the Jays back in 2019 around the draft really wanted him. And so this is someone that it's sort of a recurring theme with the Jays. They want their guys, right? They do a lot of scouting and a lot of prep, and they'll keep on guys, So in the case of Macko, this was someone that they had been keeping an eye on for a while. And I totally agree with you, whether it's to acquire a big league piece at the deadline or whether it's just to have more organizational depth when it comes to pitching prospects, neither one hurts.
Yeah. And I think, it's hard to fault fans for not knowing who Adam Macko is. I mean, we sit here and we dive into these players consistently, but there's so many players in Major League Baseball, so many minor league prospects. You don't know who's going to hit. It's probably it is the most unpredictable of any sport, of trying to figure out who's going to actually make it. But I feel very confident this is either going to be a nice piece to move or he's going to be a nice long-term piece for the team.
And so when you pair that with the addition of Erik Swanson and given what you said regarding Hernandez and his contract and the fact that he's a free agent at the end of 2023, you start to look at it. It's like, well, that actually does make a lot of sense then for what this team needs, right? The team doesn't necessarily need, especially after the rest of the moves they made, a ton of thump in their lineup. What they need right now is run prevention. And so Erik Swanson does that. And Adam Macko provides some development in the minors, or some potential for development in the minors. He was at high A last year, and you'd expect that perhaps at some point this year he'll make his way to Double A. So, there's a guy who's not too far away from the bigs, and lots of strikeouts coming from the left side never hurts.
And we're going to talk about run prevention plenty, with Kiermaier and Varsho, a little bit later. But it still stands true. A run saved is just as good as a run scored. And I think people don't necessarily think about it that way.
Well, exactly. There'll be more 3-1 wins. There'll be more 4-2 wins this year, as opposed to having to outslug your way to a victory, which happened a lot in the last few years, not just in 2022. So when it comes to Teoscar, obviously, I think one thing that people will remember a lot about him is he had a huge game 2 in the wild card game, if you recall. He was a monster in that game. And that power will be missed, by the way, at points for sure. But this is someone who's replaceable. Let's be honest. Not good defensively, well below average defensively, not good on the base pass, prone to a number of mistakes out there, both on the base pass and defensively. And as we know in playoff baseball and just big games, you can't be making those mistakes. And I don't think that necessarily that was the reason Teoscar was traded. I think it was more the whole picture coming into scope for the Jays. And if you recall, this was one of the first big moves of the baseball offseason in general. So they really set the market here, and it was clear that the Jays wanted to get out in front of it and make this move.
Yeah, and I think, I look back, and I think Teoscar's a pretty consistent player at this point in his career, but I look, to last offseason, and you watch guys like Marcus Semien walk.
Yeah.
And you think, how are we going to replace that?
Yeah.
And then you look at the start that Semien got off to. Mm-hmm. Especially in baseball, performances can be very unpredictable at times. And, what you get one year, I just talked about flukes. It is, you'll see these guys, they're very talented. They're going to put up consistent numbers, but it's not always necessarily like we talked about with Vladdy that year. Like you're not going to get that year, the 2021 Vladdy every single year. That's just not the way it's going to work.
Yeah. Yeah. And especially in terms of betting on a guy in the future, I'm sure they thought about giving Teoscar an extension at a reasonable number, but I think for both parties, that probably wasn't something that was of interest. Teoscar, power hitters who don't play great defense in the corner don't exactly age well. You know what I mean? And so I think that, and it's not like he has a ton of speed or anything. He just seems like one of those guys who isn't exactly going to have a super great last few years of his career. And I think that when it comes to a free agency deal, it's hard to project. And someone will give him probably a decent chunk of cash, especially depending on the year he has this year, but not a guy that is going to cost you too much in the future, I don't think.
Not with guys coming up that are going to be free agents that are more of a core piece than
absolutely
Teoscar.
Right. And there's already so much money tied up in the future. And now you're going to have Varsho controllable through 26. We're going to get to that in a few minutes. But yeah, you're right. This team is already spending a lot of money. Currently, they're close to, if not in the top 5 in Major League Baseball payrolls, right? So, and that's before Vlad and Bo and potentially Manoah extensions, right? So it really just starts to add up, and that's not factoring in all the renovations that they're doing. And like they're spending on this team. But you got to look at the whole picture here. And part of that picture was the next move they made, signing Kevin Kiermaier to a 1-year, $9 million deal. Now, formerly a bit of a villain to this fan base. So this was met with a little bit of skepticism, especially considering his injury history. But, Matt, I think given what we just talked about, run prevention, everything else, this move actually made a lot of sense for the Jays.
Yeah, and I think, you look at the number, what was it? Was it right on 9 million?
Yes, believed to be
Um,
9 million. Yes,
this is going to sound insane, but that's not a lot of money in today's Major League
totally.
Baseball for
Yeah.
1 year. And you hear people say all the time, there's no such thing as a bad 1 year contract, because he's coming off the books at the end of the year. If he
Right.
plays well, you can, there's versatility there. It's not like they locked him up for 5 years at 9 million a year. I mean, you take a flyer on the guy, and it's weird to say take a flyer on Kevin Kiermaier, but he's going to play good defense. That, and that's kind of what you were looking for.
For me, a big part of this deal too is the experience. Right, you get a guy who's been around the block for a long time in the AL East. I don't know how much that necessarily matters, but he's comfortable in all the ballparks, etc. Has a lot of familiarity with Toronto, right? And in some good ways and some bad. Of course, we had the Jays scouting report card drama in late September of 2021. I'd imagine that a lot of that is water under the bridge. I hope at this point for Jays fans, it's not that big of a deal. It didn't really come back to bite them, I don't think.
Yeah,
And move on. That's what
yeah,
I would
I had
say.
almost forgotten about that, to be honest with
Right?
you. And again, like we talked about, I think a big part of this deal is getting Springer out of center field every
Yeah.
day.
Yeah.
Springer will still play center field, I would assume, here and there, but he's primarily going to be a corner guy. And if that can help keep him healthy, or, give him some more consistency on the field as far as staying healthy, I think that's well worth it. I think, again, this is a deal that had many factors go into it.
Yeah, and certainly some risk. As you said, not in terms of contract. $9 million for a major league team is not that much in today's day and age. But he had right hip surgery in July of last year. Okay, this is a guy who plays a premium defensive position. He has for a long time. Turns 33 in April. Not going to do much offensively. You're not going to get much in the way of offensive production. So there is a little bit of concern there. Like again, the issue would be if Springer is out, let's say for a little bit, and then also Kiermaier's out for a little bit, you know what I mean? And you end up kind of in a similar situation as you did last year, but you'd like to think you're increasing the odds that one of them can stay healthy. That's the goal, I think, here. And again, like Kiermaier is literally one of the best defensive center fielders of his era, of the last 10 years. Okay. If obviously Jays fans recall back in the mid 2010s when Kevin Pillar was competing with Kiermaier and Trout for Gold Gloves in center field in the American League. And it was often Kiermaier who would win that battle because he ranked in the top, 99th percentile or the top 1%, I guess, in this case, when it came to outs above average and outfield jump and sprint speed and everything else. And so this is a guy who provides that pedigree and also, by all accounts, is a pretty good clubhouse presence too. So adds a little bit of experience by that measure as well. Again, that's obviously hard to quantify. We are not in the clubhouse. We do not know what goes on in there or how much that matters, but I'm sure it can't hurt. He still provides a lot of speed as well. And again, the biggest thing with him is he stays healthy. I think his floor as a nice addition to this team is pretty high.
Yeah. I mean, this is guys can hit the bottom of the lineup at the end of the day and play, hopefully. Well, he's going to play good defense. I won't even say hopefully. But we talk a lot about health, and it absolutely needs to be considered going in the offseason. But if that was your only measure, you'd sign 150 guys every offseason because baseball, look at the ILs every year in baseball. So it obviously needs to be considered, needs to be taken seriously. But at the same time, you got to balance that with the quality of the player that you're going to get.
And you hope that having just had hip surgery, that he's good to go, at least for the foreseeable future. So we kind of look at it now, you're starting to see sort of a picture form. Now, at this point of the offseason, there was clearly still sort of a gap when it came to that offensive production, right? So you're thinking, okay, yes, I hope it's not just Kiermaier replacing Teoscar, right? Now, of course, in the middle of the offseason, it's hard to, when you're in the eye of the storm, it's hard to really get out and have that whole perspective. You kind of have to wait till the offseason's finished. But, another big move that I think was a big surprise. Kiermaier was a minor surprise, but you knew that the Jays were kind of going to be interested in getting a good defensive outfielder, and that is Kiermaier. But they bring in Don Mattingly as a bench coach, obviously of Yankees fame, of a Dodger manager for a while, Marlins manager for a while. For me, Matt, this came out of complete nowhere.
Yeah, I did not see this one coming. And the big thing that I saw was, well, he's coming in to be under Schneider, and if Schneider can't get the job done, Mattingly's sitting there. I don't necessarily think that's the case. I think the more experienced big league minds you can have in a dugout, the better. Schneider's, a young guy that plays, likes to, push the envelope a little bit on the field, and Mattingly's a little bit of that, kind of an old school guy. So we'll see how it works, but I don't think that was necessarily the reason for the move.
No, I just think it's an example of stockpiling experience, right? And a guy who's, been around the block. And Mattingly, he's been in pretty much every situation you could probably be in as a big leaguer. You know what I mean? And it was funny. I remember saying to a couple friends, well, there's your left-handed hitter right there. Obviously, a guy who won 9 Gold Gloves at first base. I'm sure him and Vladdy will get along tremendously. I thought a unique angle too, of course, playing with the Yankees. And now he's in a division where there's going to be a bit of a rivalry against the Yankees. I think that's a fun little storyline to follow throughout the year. But what really got me, I think, excited about this move was what Mattingly talked about in his opening press conference / Zoom call. Ross Atkins just called him up for a chat, and that's what piqued his interest right away, he said. I thought that was interesting. I just didn't expect that.
Yeah, and I think it goes to show that Don Mattingly wouldn't come up here to be a bench coach, I don't think, on a 60-win team.
No,
I
exactly.
think he believes that this is an opportunity. And like you said, it piqued his interest right away. Probably because you watched the Jays win 92 games and lose in the wild card round. Like, this is a chance to win a World Series. That is the expectation, whether you like it, Ross Atkins and Shapiro or not. They've shown that they're going to spend and they're going to do what they need to build a winning team. Whether they've done that or not will be decided on the field. But you can't fault them for not trying or not looking at all angles and trying to make the team better.
And as you said regarding Schneider, I mean, sure, you have a guy with a ton more experience behind him, lurking or whatever the term you want to use. I think it's more about having like a great sounding board for Schneider to bounce ideas off of. The Jays always talk about being collaborative, right, and making decisions as a group. And the modern day major league team, everything's made. Lineup decisions aren't made just by the manager sitting in his office by himself, right?
Yeah,
this is a team effort. I think this is another step in getting a different voice into the room. A guy with a ton of experience, bit of an old school sort of mentality. I remember tweeting, what's he going to think of the home run jacket, right? But I do wonder if that is kind of a part of the theme of this Jays offseason, where they're moving towards more experience, more sort of serious, old school type, which I'm not saying is good or bad. It's just a little different than what we've seen here the last few years.
You know what's funny? I'm glad you brought that up because before we got on here, I was thinking about that. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if I buy that. Like, the having fun, like having too much fun. Right. Like, I get it. It optically, sometimes I can see how that really rubs the old school fan the wrong way. But as far as results on the field, I think that was overblown. But again, Mattingly brings all this experience to this team now, right? It's a different voice than Schneider. Schneider has managed and coached a lot of these guys coming up. Mattingly is not. So it's sometimes when, I find in any line of work, when you're so invested in the guys that you have, sometimes you don't notice things that an outsider might see. So I think it's more about that, and the experience can't be understated. And I think it's a good move for the Jays. I really do. And I don't think Schneider has anything to worry about. I mean, if he goes out and wins 70 games, he's going to have something to worry about anyways. So
no kidding. Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, this is a win now team, regardless of if Mattingly's here or not, right? And that pressure will remain. I totally agree with you. We only see like 10% maybe of like all the team's interactions throughout the season, and that might be a little liberal in saying 10%. Like, you don't know what's really going on. You don't know how much their seriousness or lack of seriousness factors in. I mean, just because someone smiles doesn't mean that they're not taking it seriously.
Yeah, I mean? and there's people that will say the other thing. Guys that are too serious are,
right.
that's an issue. Mm-hmm. The Boston Red Sox were wheeling each other around in a laundry cart.
Yeah,
who cares? What does it matter? I mean, you had fun when you hit a home run?
Yeah,
I don't know. It's an old school mindset that I think is getting weeded out of the game. And I'm probably somewhere in the middle. Like, would I wheel myself around in a laundry cart or put on a WWE belt? Probably not. But if that's truly who you are as a person and as a player, and it's not faked or a show, then there's nothing wrong with that.
And obviously nuance is important, right? Not everything is black and white. Like, maybe there was aspects, maybe there was points of the season. Obviously Montoyo got fired, and maybe that was a point of the season where they did feel that they lacked some leadership and had to make a change. Maybe when they had a really rocky August, there was that Angels series where they got completely wiped in front of 3 straight 40,000 attendance crowds. Maybe that was something. Maybe there was a talk after that. Hey, we need to step it up and take things more seriously. I don't know. Again, we're not in there, but I think by and large, like, these are major league players, right? Like, if you get to the majors, you take the sport seriously.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, is those two things can go hand in hand. You can still have those conversations when those things happen and still have fun with the home run jacket, right? It doesn't have to be one or the other. And I think that's kind of where this team has gone. Mm-hmm. It's not going to be one or the other. They both can happen at the same time. Yeah,
there can be two truths. You can take the game seriously and also celebrate a lot when you do something great. Baseball's hard, and I think players can celebrate how they want to. It'd be interesting to learn about the guy and a little bit about what he is doing. I hope that Sportsnet does some cool features and stuff on Mattingly, because there would be a lot I think that fans would be interested in to learn. And now, a word from the Baseball Zone, as their 20th annual Baseball Zone Swing into Spring March Break Baseball Camp is coming soon. TBZ welcomes all players aged 5 to 13 years old to join the Zone's coaches for some baseball fun. They can develop skills while also having fun and, of course, appreciating the great game. So get out of the house and join the Baseball Zone the week of March 13th to 17th. So we've talked a lot about kind of the lineup and the hitters and the outfield defense and just rejigging things a little bit, building on this core. But now let's take a little bit of a look at the rotation here, because, you kind of look at this rotation last year, heading into the season. I think people were really, really optimistic, right? You've got obviously Gausman and Manoah, right? Two horses up front. You've got Barrios, who prior to last year was expected to be, one of the most consistent pitchers in all of baseball. Right. And then you've got Yusei Kikuchi and Ross Stripling, who, you'd hope that you have some reliability and upside there. Now, that didn't all happen, right? Barrios and Kikuchi were both disasters last year. Barrios struggled. He just got hit really hard. His fastball had a lot of issues last year. And Kikuchi was just a unmitigated disaster. I'm sorry. And so they needed some reliability in that rotation. I think they needed some consistency. And so they went out and spent big to get it. They signed Chris Bassitt to a 3-year, $63 million deal, $21 million a year for a guy in his mid-30s. That's a lot. But when you take a look at what Bassitt provides, it's exactly what this team needs, Matt. Consistency, lots of ground balls, lots of innings, and experience.
Yeah, and I think they addressed the bullpen, partially with Swanson, like we talked about earlier. But really, there's two ways to address a bullpen if it needs addressing. You either add innings at the back end, quality innings, or you add more innings in the rotation. And that's what they did here. I think Bass had over 180 innings. Yep. Barrios is an inning eater. Gausman, Manoah, can push 200 innings each. So that's just more innings that you're taking and pressure you're taking off of the bullpen if these guys perform.
Like you said, I mean, having now all these different options in the rotation, right? You really have 4 guys, banking on Barrios bouncing back a little bit and not having quite as much of a disaster as last year, which I think should be expected from a guy who has such a good track record as Barrios had. I mean, you have 4 really, really quality pitchers in that rotation. And you know what? There could still be room at the deadline if Kikuchi or Mitch White or whoever else is in that 5th spot isn't working out. You have room to go and add another at the deadline here.
Yeah, and I just pulled it up. We talk about bounce backs, and I would be shocked if Barrios didn't bounce back to be, he's looking at like the number 4 start. He might be the best number 4 starter in baseball this year.
Very well could be, yeah.
He had, I think, 6 years before last year that were super consistent. That could be a huge pickup by the Jays that they didn't even pick up. That's just sitting there and is going to bounce back. So, and if he can do that, and you're looking at Manoah, Gausman, Bassitt, Barrios, if you would have told me that going into last year, that's the best rotation potentially in baseball.
No kidding. And I mean, what are you going to get from Kikuchi this year? Could it possibly be as bad as last year? Maybe, but even if it's a bit of a step up, there could be a role there where he's sort of a long reliever, or he could be your 5th starter at least early on in the season to get his feet wet, if you will.
Yeah, and I think Blue Jays fans will complain about this, but going into spring training, there's no way he's not going to get an opportunity, I don't think, to be that 5th starter. You see Mitch White, but how much more consistent is that? There might be some guys emerge, you never know, but I think Kikuchi's probably going to get the first crack at being that 5th guy. And if the top 4 perform the way they're capable, it may not matter, to be honest, what you get out of Kikuchi or what you get out of that number 5 spot.
And again, that's something that will likely be a bigger concern like in the first half of the season. because second half, first of all, like come playoff time, your rotation is smaller anyways. But second half, I would expect that if that's an issue, they will go and acquire a starting pitcher. I mean, you don't go all in this much to then be like, well, we can't acquire another starter. So they certainly will. So, and also think about Hyunjin Ryu maybe coming back in August. I know that might be a little optimistic, but there's a possibility there. Ricky Tiedemann, the star Jays prospect, could he come up at some point in July, August? Now, maybe not. And again, banking on pitchers who've never pitched in the bigs to just step into a rotation spot is not always smart thinking, but there's a lot of options there. I mean, we could do the Nate Pearson circus again for the fourth year in a row, talking about how he could be in the rotation. So there's options there.
I mean, yeah, you say, in a Tiedemann coming up late and stepping up, it's not like it's never happened before.
Yeah, totally.
I mean, look at the Tampa Bay, David Price made his debut in the playoffs.
And so that's really something to consider too when it comes to the rotation. But this just adds so much quality. And he's old school. Bassitt is, when it comes to it. That's why he probably will age well, and another good experienced vet to have, because he doesn't really rely on his velocity. He'll sit sort of low 90s, great command, lots of pitches, and he limits hard contact. Right, he gets ground balls, he gets out of innings.
Yeah, and ground balls at Rogers Center, that's where you need to keep them. So yeah. And I like the 3-year deal. I don't think it's too much, but I also didn't mind the 3-year Kikuchi deal. So not saying that that's going to happen to Bassitt, but it's relatively low risk as far as term.
Totally. And as we just touched on the consistency and everything else, I mean, if he were to completely blow up next year, it would be a surprise for, I think, pretty much everybody. So the Bassitt deal for me was pretty much one that was probably the most liked of the offseason. Hard to not like it, right? At this point, you can really start to see kind of the theme of the offseason emerging, run prevention, right? But now it's like, okay, well, they seem to have the rotation mostly settled, right? They added a piece to the bullpen. Now what? What's next? And so it kind of got quiet for a while there. And there had been talk about the Blue Jays and Arizona linking up, right? Because Arizona could use some catching depth and they have lots of outfield depth. The Jays have lots of catching and needed an outfielder, ideally someone who could hit left-handed. So it did seem to be a natural match there. Now, obviously, there were a lot of possibilities, right? And the catcher logjam for the Jays was one of the biggest themes of the offseason. Who are you going to move, Jansen, Kirk, or Moreno? I mean, that debate was very fascinating, Matt, because one could argue to trade each one, right? You could make an argument for Moreno. You could make an argument for Kirk or for Jansen. And they chose Moreno on Festivus, making a huge deal on December 23rd, acquiring Dalton Varsho for Gurriel, Lourdes Gurriel Jr. and Gabriel Moreno. Gurriel, a bit of a surprise addition to this deal. But before we get too much into sort of the Varsho angle, I want to talk a little bit about that catcher logjam and why you think they did choose Moreno. Me personally, I think this is a win now move. This tells me that the Jays think, look, Moreno isn't going to help us in 2023 as much as a guy like Jansen or Kirk will, or Varsho for that matter. So when you look at it like that, it does make a lot of sense, but this one definitely carries some risk.
Yeah, and I think you're right, and I think it goes to show potentially what they think Moreno can be. Mm-hmm. But we're not in the offseason. They don't ask us. They know a lot more but that's a big piece to give up, a big future piece to give up. But yeah, you have Jansen. I never thought it was going to be Jansen, to be honest with you. Mm-hmm. Just his relationship with the pitching staff, the way he handles them. Yeah. Bat turned around last year. I thought maybe Kirk, just because you were going to try and capitalize on about as high as his value was going to be. And then it ended up being Moreno. So, again, you got to give to get. You trade from positions of depth. This is exactly what this was for both teams. I thought maybe it was going to be Alek Thomas coming from the Diamondbacks. But Varsho, again, run prevention and some pop that will probably only play better at Rogers Center.
Yeah, and a guy who, so transitioning to Varsho then, I mean, you give up a lot for sure, a blue chip prospect in Moreno and a serviceable big leaguer in Gurriel, an above average hitter. But what you get in Varsho is a blend of so many different wonderful things. For a Christmas time trade, here's why. Very poetic with that. But I mean, he put up 4.6 WAR via Fangraphs last year. That was 26th among all position players. And here's the thing. That was his first real, full big league season, okay? So that's something to note already. There seems to be a lot of room for growth there. 27 home runs in the NL West. You'd like to think that that's something that, as you said, his bat will only look better at Rogers Center and really in the AL East, although there aren't as many games in the AL East this year, of course. But in addition to sort of the power and the fact that he put up all that, well, the reason he put up all that WAR is because of his defense, right? He was one of the best defensive outfielders in baseball last year. He can play all three positions. He can also catch. So there's another angle. He's also going to be this team's third catcher if necessary. I don't think they want him to catch a lot of games. I think they'd prefer to use him in the outfield. What he does is he gives you so many options when it comes to building different lineups and things like that. He mashes right-handed pitching. He's not very good against lefties, I must say. So when you go into Yankee Stadium and you're taking on Carlos Rodon, it'll be interesting to see kind of how they try to maneuver that. But Varsho is a guy who, I don't know if you can measure him just up against Teoscar's offensive production, but in terms of a replacement, I think this is a pretty good one, and a guy who's under team control for 4 seasons here. So a real blend of really attractive attributes in Varsho.
Yeah, and I think that being under team control is a huge thing. This could be a guy, if you flash forward and I told you he's going to hit 30 home runs and win a Gold Glove.
Yeah.
Now what you're giving up in Gurriel, who's about to get paid as well. Mm-hmm. And the top prospect in Moreno, prospects are just that, right? We talked about earlier in baseball, there's no guarantees about these guys. And he may go on to have a very good career, but will he go on to have the same career that Dalton Varsho may have? Who knows? It's kind of the risk you take. If Varsho does what he can do, the high 20s, maybe 30 home runs, potentially drive in 75, maybe 100, that might be pushing it. And when a Gold Glover play excellent defense, I don't think you can look back at this and, look at it as a bad deal.
This certainly looks like, as you said, if he becomes sort of this perennial 30 home run hitter, constant Gold Glove nominee, and wins a couple Gold Gloves in the outfield in Toronto. And look, he plays the game hard. You know what I mean? He gives 110% every play. That'll work well in Toronto with sort of a hockey type crowd that enjoys that, enjoys the grit and the guys who, work their asses off and will put their body on, like, all those cliches. But it's true. Like, he could be a fan favorite here, but not just that. He could be a very, very effective piece of their future. Because again, if you want Springer to stay in right field beyond this year, Kiermaier's not going to be around forever. There's your future center fielder right there, and a guy who can hit for some power too. So,
and you mentioned, facing the left, he's not very good against left-handed hitters. A lot of left-handed hitters aren't very good against left-handed pitching. Yeah. But saying that, when you roll in the Yankees team, like, he's too good defensively to potentially even worry about that.
Right.
I think he's going to play every day. I think he's going to be a key part of the lineup, righty, lefty, whatever it may be, because of that defense. And who knows, still, relatively young in his career, not even 1,000 at bats yet, I don't think. So Who knows? Maybe he figures it out against lefties. Maybe he comes to Toronto. We've seen guys do that before. Teoscar, Jose Bautista. Not saying he's going to turn into that, but a change of scenery sometimes, a different perspective from a coaching staff, all could make a difference in that. And regardless, you're getting good defense. He doesn't have to worry about the left-handed pitching when he's roaming the outfield.
For me, this certainly carries risk. Like, again, I could paint a picture where instead of being that perennial power threat, great defense, he gets hurt a lot, right? Because of sort of a bigger frame and because he plays the game so intensely. But again, you could say that about everybody, right? Injuries are random. Injuries are a part of sports, and certainly a part of baseball. But, if Moreno turns into the next Buster Posey down in Arizona, and Varsho is just a guy who's good defensively but strikes out too much, sort of like I don't want to say Colby Rasmus, but, you know what I mean? It could go that way too, but this is a risk you take if you're a win now team.
Yeah, I mean, and you mentioned, it's funny you mentioned the name Colby Rasmus. That's someone I haven't thought about in a while. But yeah, I mean, that's part of a trade. You know what I mean? You don't win them all, and you look back, and at the time when they traded Barrios for Simeon Woods Richardson and Austin Martin, I mean, people question that, and Barrios had a great end of that season, and now, who knows what people think about that after last season. So so many things can happen. It's hard to project. And that's why we sit here, with our mics and try to do our best, but that's just the way it goes.
Certainly easier said than done when it comes to those kinds of things. And to give you another example of a top prospect who still hasn't worked out, Nate Pearson, right? Close to home. You just never know with these guys. So,
well, what are you going to get out of him? I mean, pitching,
right.
Some guys are late bloomers. It's not easy to pitch to big league hitters. Is that a guy that can come into the bullpen and make some noise? Hard thrower. what they've lacked really, other than Romano. So who knows?
Yeah, and you hope regarding Pearson that, they're sort of done with the whole starter's dream with him, maybe. But like I think he's better as a like multi-inning, once through the lineup, just pumping 100 in there and getting some outs, I think. And bridging just sort of the back end of that bullpen, I think is a perfect role for him. And that would help him hopefully stay healthy too, because that's been a huge part of his career.
Yeah, I agree. And that's kind of something going to spring training that people may not be talking about as much, what Nate Pearson's going to do. But that could be another huge pickup that didn't cost you anything.
And there could still be more moves regarding the bullpen and things like that. And, sometimes the low key additions in the bullpen are the ones that have the biggest impacts. But another kind of low key acquisition that
the Tampa Bay Rays about the bullpen.
There you go. Exactly.
Nate, ask an average baseball fan to name 5 guys in the Rays bullpen most years, and they can't do it. So, and it's one of the best in baseball every year. So that just goes to show.
And Tampa also shows that there's different ways to win games, right? They're all about run prevention, good defense, timely hitting, yes, but you better play good defense and pitch really well. And I think that that's a reason why they're constantly a winning team. Speaking of winning teams, though, the Jays also, later on in the offseason, more recently, picked up a 2-time World Series champion, former San Francisco Giant, Brandon Belt. And so here's a guy who comes in, another lefty, right? Another proven veteran, right? With playoff experience, big game experience. This is a guy who's had a fantastic career and puts together really good at-bats. Now, positionally, it's sort of an intriguing fit, right? Because obviously the Jays are set at first with Vladdy. Belt, to me, doesn't seem like a guy you want to put in left field very much when you have guys like Varsho and Kiermaier. So it's going to be interesting to see, how that shakes out. But on a 1-year, $9.3 million deal, just a clubhouse leader, right? And a guy who wants to be here. I think that that's also something that this offseason has proved is like there's guys who are choosing to play here. Kiermaier picked Toronto over the Dodgers. Belts, I don't know how many other suitors he had, but he wanted to come here. Don Mattingly wanted to come here. That is also really Bassitt, another guy who was willing to come here. I don't know what kind of suitors he had, but you look at Belt and you look at what he's capable of, especially in 2020 and 2021, really, really impressive stuff.
Yeah, and I think, again, we're going to talk about health. We said you can't really predict health, but we're going to talk about it again with Belt coming off the knee injury, right? So and he says he's healthy, and if he is, then I love this deal. I mean, I don't think he sees any time in the outfield. It's a first base DH type of thing, but gets Vladdy off his feet sometimes, more than capable of playing first, another left-handed bat. So again, a 1-year deal at $9.3 million. Like I said with Kiermaier, I really don't see a downside to this. I thought it was a fantastic pickup.
And he said he expects to primarily DH, and I'm sure he'll come off the bench a good amount as well. But again, if Brandon Belt's coming off your bench, like that's pretty good, and that's very, very impressive depth. And so that's really what this is about too: is creating more depth, giving yourself more options off the bench, giving yourself more options to create unique lineups. If there's a day where you want to DH Guerrero Jr. and play Belt at first, you can do that if you want. But as a DH, hopefully Springer will need less time DHing this year. With him in right field, obviously Teoscar isn't around anymore. Gurriel had some time at DH, so those two are gone. Kiermaier certainly won't DH much. So there is some room there, even with Moreno gone now. Kirk will still DH a bit, but you've got a lot more sort of room for playing time for a guy like Belt, and I think a guy you want to create playing time for.
Yeah, I don't think you leave a guy like Brandon Belt on the market, when he's there and he opened a 1-year, $9.3 million. Like we said, with the track record that he has, you'd almost be ridiculous not to make the phone call. And yeah, I don't see, again, I think this is a under the radar pickup that could have big upside for the Jays this year.
So that's it as of now. Obviously, there could still be some big deals to come about, but those feel like the big major deals of the offseason. So as we wrap things up, some conclusions. I think for one, it's, as I touched on briefly, like the Jays are willing to spend. Currently, if you look on SpotTrack, they are 5th in Major League Baseball luxury tax payrolls.
Yeah, like I said, they've shown that they want to win and they're willing to spend. Whether they spent in the right places, a championship, will tell you that. But there's only one winner at the end of the year. I mean, you got to do what you need to do to put yourself in the best situation. I think they truly believe they've done that, and they will continue to do that, whether it's at the deadline or before the season, gets going.
And I think what they project as to now is a more complete team, a team that is more prepared for October, a team that clearly has more leadership, more experience, which I don't think you can have enough of. And I think they've addressed a lot of their shortcomings from last year. They probably won't be the same offensive team, although if guys like Varsho pan out and Belt, then maybe you are talking about that. But it just gives them more ways to win. They can win a game 4-2 or 3-1 or 6-5. But as opposed to the last few years where, they couldn't necessarily rely on their pitching and defense as much as they probably will be able to this year, which is, I think, a welcome change for Jays fans.
Yeah, I think the term I would use for the lineup would be more dynamic.
Yeah.
It seemed, I don't want to say stale, but it seemed like they were rolling the same lineup out there. And when they were struggling, they were really struggling. And I think there's enough in this lineup now to kind of give them that versatility, and they can find different ways to produce runs.
So that about wraps it up. Obviously, they could maybe use another bullpen piece, probably another bench outfielder who can mash lefties, things like that. But we appreciate you joining us here for our CBN podcast, Jays Offseason Recap with Jackson Farough and Matt Betts. Lots of fun, right, Matt?
Yeah, and I think if you disagree or agree with anything that we've said when we tweet this out, feel free to comment. We're always down for the Blue Jays banter. So we hope you enjoyed it as much as we did.
And if you enjoy this type of content, just me and Matt hanging out, chatting, talking about things baseball, I think you can look forward to some more of that this year. We plan to do some more of that. And also, if you have any ideas for us of things to chat about, just the two of us, please be sure to let us know. Thank you for listening. Be sure to check out Canadian Baseball Network for extensive and comprehensive coverage of the latest in Canadian baseball. And The Baseball Zone, Canada's leading instructional baseball academy and training home to thousands of MLB pro, college, and youth baseball players.